Hi, my name is Bodil Jensen, and I would like to welcome you to my home here in Laval, Quebec, Canada. We're in late summer, and I am here to talk about my mother, Agnes Jelhof Jensen. I thought it would be appropriate to start outside, even though we have the sound in suburbia of somebody cutting trees. But at any rate, my mother's life revolved around her garden, and she loved gardening. She loved her plants inside, and she had great talent for growing plants. When you read her books, you will notice how often she refers to plants, trees, everything natural. And one of her favorite flowers was the marigold, which we have here on our front porch. It's a little garden my husband and I create every year. Not necessarily marigolds, but this year that's what we had in the seed pack back last May. And for my mother, it was important to see things grow. She would never plant a garden just to make it a painting. It was important for her to see the plants grow and to see everything grow. And that's in her books, that's what you find. People are growing, people are developing, people are trying to be at one with their surroundings, whether those surroundings are plants or other people. It's like life was something to be cherished, and each plant was something to be cherished. My mother did attend for her formal education Landbrugsskole, which is the agricultural college, now the University of Copenhagen. And she makes a joke in her book that nobody else in her family went there, and she had to choose something different. But actually, she loved it. And this love of plants she has passed on to me and her two granddaughters, for sure. Her grandsons, maybe less. So now that we've finished with the outside, we're going to go inside, and I hope nobody's running a chainsaw inside. Hi, we're inside, and I can take off my hat. So this is the living room, the cleaner end of the living room. The camera does wonderful tricks. Actually, I wanted to sing a song while we were outside, because if you've ever been to a Danish Folkehøjskole, where you go for a week or a month or whatever to learn different things, they sing. And the one time I went with my mother, we did a little tour in Denmark in around 96, 97 or 98. And she did a lecture at one of the folk high schools, and the first thing they do is sing. So I have selected a song which is Danish. We're only going to sing the chorus. And it's one of the songs that's mentioned in the one of the books I'm talking about today, which is Hello Canada. And this is one of the songs we actually learned when we were sitting around the bonfire at the Danish church camp at Wabamun Lake, just west of Edmonton. And it's Mallebrok er død i krigen. So I will sing, and I hope you will sing along with me in your own homes. Mallebrok er død i krigen, fille young gang gang, fille young gang gang. Mallebrok er død i krigen i 1864. I 1864, i 1864. Mallebrok er død i krigen i 1864. That wasn't so bad. So, what brings us here today? It started with my mother writing, of course, but it started more recently because one of the publishers in Denmark decided it was time to put my mother's books out as ebooks. Those are the books that my mother wrote over her lifetime, about 14 of them. Depends how you count them. But the 5 books that were made into ebooks recently are the 5 books she wrote in Danish. 2 of them have been translated, as Hello Canada and Dilemma. The other 3 remain untranslated, except that one of them, Who's in Canada, was originally published or written in English and published, one of the last books she published, Too Many Tomorrows. I personally have destroyed most of the copies of Too Many Tomorrows because it is so poorly edited. Who's in Canada, on the other hand, represents a mature author who has taken something she wrote many, many years previously in English, put it into Danish, and when I recently read it, actually I listened to it, most of it on tape, I was just thrilled with what I heard. Much more thrilled than when I read it when it originally came out. But then I myself have matured so much in the intervening years. So what brings us here today is the fact that Saga Egmont, a publisher in Denmark, decided that my mother's books, which were written, the last one was published in the mid-90s in Denmark, should not just vanish into Never Never Land. They wanted to put them out as ebooks. The goal of Saga Egmont is to bring stories to life, which has many meanings. When I asked them recently why they chose my mother's books, this is what they wrote to me. Author Agnes Jelhof Jensen was first published in Denmark more than 40 years ago. Now Saga has chosen to revive her books. In some, she tells the story of her own eventful life. Some, she writes about fictional characters who are also living the consequences of the Second World War. Here at Saga, we believe literature has the power to change people's mindsets. And moreover, a well-written story never goes out of fashion. The stories of Agnes Jelhof Jensen deal with the past in a personal way and are important testimonies to both the dark chapters of human history and of hope and happiness in unexpected places. At Saga, we believe that Agnes Jelhof Jensen's books deal with topics which are able to touch people today across time because they deal with themes as universal as war, love, family, and not least trying to make a home in a new country. I think many of you have been there. If not in World War II, then in succeeding wars. If not immigrating in 1954, like my mother did, then more recently. Some of you have even been refugees. And not to forget that one of the most traumatic experiences in my mother's life was that she was a refugee. She came from an Orthodox Jewish home, and she was a refugee with her 9-month-old baby and her husband in this mass rescue of the Jews in Denmark, which occurred in October of 1943. She told me at one point that the worst experience in her life was when she had to accept the fact that somebody was injecting her son, her 9-month-old son, with something in his, you can imagine this chubby little boy, chubby little baby being injected in his thigh by somebody my mother didn't know, because he had to be silenced during the crossing from Denmark to Sweden. I'm happy to say he survived that very well, and he is still thriving to this day in his, how old is he? He's born in 1943. Well, you figure it out. He's plus 75. I remember his 75th birthday, which I happily celebrated with him in Denmark, and we went skating. And I can tell you, as a Canadian who has been on skates most of her life, I was the star on that little ice rink in Frederiksberg Park. And in fact, I apparently looked like a rock star because I had on my mother's mink and a flamboyant red hat and red winter pants to match. At any rate, that was a happy birthday. And it goes to show what can happen in a lifetime, which is just amazing, because my mother starts off her life in a fairly well-to-do, well, very well-to-do home in Copenhagen, in Frederiksberg. And she has quite a happy childhood, and then World War II pops up. She gets married, they have a son, they have to flee to Sweden. She has been writing at that point since she was 15. Her first printed or published work was in, I think it was Berlingske, and it was about how one smells flowers. You know, she was an observer. My mother, as I said, was an observer, and that made her a storyteller, a really good storyteller. And that's what her books consist of. She's telling a story, whether it's a short story or a longer story. I translated Hello Canada into Hello Canada. And when I went to the American conference, the American Literary Translators Association conference, I read a short excerpt from the work I was doing then, which was Hello Canada. And although there were only 2 or 3 people in the whole audience who understood Danish, they actually laughed when I read the Danish. So what I'm going to do now is read a short excerpt in Danish, and then I'll read my translation. And for those of you who don't understand Danish, you still might appreciate the humor in it, just from the way the words are used and the words are told. My mother is talking about her time as a volunteer, and she's going to talk about, what she's talking about here is the years, about 5 years, she was captain of a Girl Guide troop. Jeg var også troppefører i 5 år for 70 pigespejder af 17 forskellige nationer og 21 trosbekendelser. Det var heller ikke uden drama. Især husker jeg tydeligt en dag, da hele banden stod på stribe, og jeg forklarede dem noget om det næste møde. Det var tydeligt, at de ikke forstod mig. 69 af dem betragtede mig som med et tåget blankt blik. Men nummer 70, en lille, kvik østriger, vendte sig om til sine spejderkammerater og forklarede dem, hvad jeg mente. Så var det min tur at undre mig, for det var slet ikke, hvad jeg mente, Og så begyndte vi at diskutere, hvad jeg sagde, og hvad jeg mente, og hvad jeg mente, jeg sagde, og hvad jeg sagde, jeg mente. Det tog sin tid at redde trådene sammen. Men vi kom til en slags international forståelse. Da mødet var forbi, sagde min lille østrigske redningsdame godnat med et velmenende, det er helt i orden. Min mor kan heller ikke tale engelsk. Now for the English. I was also troop leader for 5 years for 70 guides from 17 different nations and 21 different religions. It wasn't without drama. I especially remember a day when the whole troop stood in line and I explained something about the next meeting. It was clear they had not understood me. 69 of them stared at me with foggy, blank looks, but number 70, a little quick Austrian, turned to her sister guides and explained what I meant. Then it was my turn to marvel, because that was not at all what I had meant, and we began to discuss what I had said and what I meant, and what I meant I had said, and what I said I had meant. It took time to untangle all the threads, but we reached a kind of international understanding. When the meeting ended, my little Austrian lifesaver said good night, and a well-meant, don't worry, my mother can't speak English either. So how did I learn to speak Danish? Well, my mother in Hello Canada claims it's because they said my sister and I, could not come with them to Denmark unless we spoke Danish. I don't think I was ever threatened. In fact, the only thing I remember about going to Denmark, like what had to be done to go to Denmark, was we had to learn to spread our toes apart. Somebody we met somewhere said, well, only children who can spread their toes apart can get to Denmark. And I won't trouble you with my feet now, but I can tell you I can still spread all my toes apart because I practice that every day, which is probably my way of telling myself, yes, I can go to Denmark. But how did my sister and I learn Danish? I never went to school in Denmark at all. I came to Canada when I was 5. But what happened was my parents spoke to each other and our relatives sent all these wonderful letters to us. And when we got together for lunch, I especially remember lunch, maybe the mail came in the morning, and we were all sitting there and my mother was reading, and she was so animated when she was reading that it was, you just couldn't help but keep up the language. And we had enough relatives, and remember, this isn't the 50s. This is not instant communication. You didn't pick up the phone. You didn't, there was no internet. And you certainly never used the phone unless it was very important. And if you used the phone, what you said, the first thing you said was, this is not an emergency. Everybody is well. Telegrams were the order of the day. Even when I got married in 1981, my wedding album is full of telegrams from Denmark. But my mother would read over lunch. We would have open-faced sandwiches. My dad would be home for lunch. My sister would be there. We came home from school for lunch. And my mother would read these letters. And she would comment on them. And she would sing. And she would, it was so animated. It was like a little piece of theater. So of course, I as a child wanted to understand. And I did understand. Because my parents spoke to me consistently in Danish. Our bedtime stories were in Danish. And there was no way we could lose the language. My mother, being a writer, had to maintain the language. even after she started writing in English, in the last book she wrote. But by then, she was still writing so much in Danish, if nothing else, letters to her family and friends, that there was no problem for my mother and I to speak Danish. In fact, I think one of the joys of my life was translating the 2 books that I did, because anything I had problems with, my mother was there and we would talk about it. What did these words mean? What did she mean to say? So the translations certainly owe a lot to her input. So the first book my mother wrote was Hello, Canada. While I say it's the first book she wrote, she had already been writing many short stories. She'd already written several books that weren't published. She wrote articles that were published in all the major papers in Denmark. We had traveled across Canada interviewing many immigrants, my father taking photos. Hello, Canada, the version that she published years after the original one came out, has a photo of the family as we were when we immigrated in 1954. And this photo was actually used by the Canadian immigration authorities to entice Danes to come to Canada. And my mother wrote the little pamphlet that went with it. The stories that are in the book are more or less true. More or less true in the sense that when she talks about making rye bread, yes, she did pass her rye bread recipe on, and I do have the bowl that she used to make her rye bread, but she passed the rye bread recipe on to my son, who now has custody of it. And in fact, I learned to make rye bread from somebody else, but that's neither here nor there. What I have is a photo album. My dad was a photographer. He had his own darkroom. He was a chemical engineer by profession. And this photo album has photos in it which illustrate the stories that my mother has collected in Hello, Canada. So I'd like to show you these photos and make comments on them to show, because it's interesting for me and I hope interesting for you, and will show you that what my mother talks about really did happen. So if I open the photo book, we have, of course, loose photos, again, a good album. And we have a picture of my mother sitting knitting. She was a terrific knitter. She knit right up until she died, which was just past her 90th birthday. And she could knit, like many knitters, sitting watching TV, because it was just so automatic. And my daughter has this ability, not me, but my daughter. The next photo is of me sitting knitting in my brownie outfit, and it's the same chair. In the background you see my dad's violin and a copper kettle, which where my mother had collected soil from the various countries she had lived in, and at some point I think that was supposed to be scattered on her grave. By the time we got that far, there was no soil in any of the copper kettles in her home. The next photo is one where my parents are getting their Canadian citizenship. When they immigrated wholeheartedly. I don't recall them ever saying Denmark was better or them regretting they'd come. They just dove into Canada and became Canadians. Not that they weren't still Danish. Our food was Danish. But they just felt that they should participate fully in the society to which they had come, and citizenship was the key to that. I still have the Bible that my dad and mom are holding there. The next photo is a picture of me actually being welcomed into the 49th company, and that my mother was captain of. And you see the Union Jack. That was before Canada got its own maple leaf flag, and there's my mother as captain. And the next one I'm going to show you is me and my sister sitting on the curb. You can see the Union Jack. Again, Canada doesn't have its flag. My mother dressed my sister and I very much alike, and my mother made the clothes. I suspect if this was in color, we would see that the sweaters were this beautiful deep red, and it was my grandmother, my famo, who knit those sweaters for my sister and myself. Mine looks like it's just getting a tad too small. I remember those dresses. They were tartan, green, and red. We're sitting on the curb. I don't look too happy, and maybe that's because we're sitting on the curb and we've been waiting a long time. But at any rate, my mother describes this visit of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, and that she wanted my dad to take a picture. And there's the picture. My mother describes it as his hand reaching out like an octopus. You know, if you can imagine your hand with 8 fingers. And there's the photo. Definitely, we do not see Queen Elizabeth. But my mother was perfectly right. Years later, I did meet the Queen, and I was a diplomat at the time, and I must say she is an extremely entertaining person, very much her own person, very much in control of any conversation she's in. We move on. I'm not sure if we took the picture of the hula hoops, but we all learned how to hula hoop. Then we have a photo of us camping, and the car is a Pontiac, not our first car, but we camped in all weather. And this was at Fish Lake, which is close to the Rocky Mountains, west of Edmonton. And there, you know, when you camp in the late summer, you will find snow on your tent in the morning. So the next photo is a summer picture of our Pontiac. This is the car that did take us all the way to Toronto. We moved there briefly in '56, and when we were going to relocate back to Edmonton, we didn't just beeline it back. No, we made a 6-week trip out of it, went all the way out to the Atlantic and all the way back to the Pacific before we crossed the mountains again. And this photo, it looks like there's snow on the ground. I'm not sure about that, but that is the Pontiac in the Rocky Mountains. And there you have a black bear, which at that time I think people fed, and that's why when you went to the Rockies at that time, you always saw black bears, and you always saw them along the roads. Now, of course, that's under control, and we don't feed the bears, and they don't come out. Then we moved up economically, and the Ford. My dad loved Fords because they started really well in the cold winters, and that was our first new car, red and white. I just wonder why red and white. It's a good thing the Canadian flag became red and white. And there we are. My mother's in the driver's seat. My dad's taking the picture. Then we have Christmas. That was Christmas 1959. And that tree is as slim as it is, as well spaced in the branches as it is, because I suspect at that time we still had candles, real candles on the tree. Now at a certain point, my sister and I rebelled and said, we don't want candles. It is a fire hazard. And my dad, who was quite a traditionalist, had to bow to that. I still have those candle holders, and one day I have this huge spruce tree in my front yard. When the wind is right and we're sure not to burn down the house, there's snow on the ground, I might put them out there, but I'm not going to light them inside. There's part of the story dealing with the black bears also deals with the lynx that my mother and father encountered when they were out fishing in the little aluminum boat with the dog. We always had a black lab, and the photo of my girlfriend and I think we were maybe 14 at the time, up at the lake, at Long Lake, where we had our cabin and still have the cabin. It's the very aluminum boat that my parents fished in, and I don't know if it's this black lab or the next one that was on that fishing trip. But you can see how small the boat is, and if you've ever seen a lynx, how dangerous the whole operation was. And then we have Bill Mills, who my parents described as the last cowboy of the Old West. He actually came and settled in Hanna, at India, near Hanna, where Hanna is where Nickelback comes from, out on virtually the bald prairie. And my dad used to go down there and hunt in the fall. And then Bill Mills, who by then, like he was a young man in 1903, almost a graduate of the London Conservatory of Music, and he would come back to Edmonton and live with friends, an English woman, Marion Peterson, and her family. Marion had married a Dane. She is talked about in Hello Canada, and it's actually her daughter, Kirsten Peterson, who is illustrated in my children's book, Stan and Morgana Go to School. But Bill Mills was very important in our lives. Here was somebody who knew about vaudeville, and he and my mother got on really well. They were both very musical, and he features in her books. Notably her English books. His whole story is there, his whole life story. And then one of the last pictures is my mother with Lester Pearson, and in the corner we have Andy Thompson. Andy Thompson, who became infamous as Senator Andy Thompson, and is the reason why in Canada you are not allowed to be a senator beyond 75. Mind you, the senators in Canada are appointed, not elected, as in the US. But Andy Thompson was a close friend of my parents, notably when we were in Toronto, and this is how they got involved in politics. Always in the background, never running for office, but For them, being a good citizen involved supporting the candidates who were running. And even I think my mother was 80-something when she endorsed one of the local candidates, who coincidentally was married to one of my childhood friends, and helped get him re-elected to the Parliament in Ottawa. This is the end of my first lecture on the two books, Hello Canada and Who's City Canada. I hope I have answered some of your questions, and I look forward to answering any question you might have.